I'm Hannah, I'm a writer, and historically, I am the slowest writer in the whole world. I published my first collection of short stories in 2018, and then didn't publish the next one until 2020. And yes, I was working a job at the time, but 2 years? It's like 15,000 words. Yikes. By the way, Starlight just had her first book birthday, so if you want to give her a celebratory read and or review, it's linked in the description and I appreciate it. Anyway, I just finished writing a novel, conception to full draft, in 5 weeks. I'm cured. For some context on that project and the timeline, it's a romance novel. It has a light magic system. It's a part of a series, so I had a lot of future books to set up in this book, so lots of world building and such, and it's 60,000 words. I decided there would be 20 chapters with 3,000 words each, because that's pretty standard for the genre, and it just sounded nice and neat, and then it worked out that way, which is unheard of for me. And what's more, I'm currently revising this book, and I did half of it in a day, half a book of revisions in one day. Like it came out as a book. So I'm doing some line edits and expanding scenes and catching typos, but the only real big change I had to make was to this clue poem, because it's a treasure hunting story that I knew I was gonna have to change later because I didn't know what I was doing with it at the time. And everything else is just a book. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't know why it's going so well, but I'm suspicious. Anyway, I thought I'd talk about that process and what I learned and what worked and didn't work. That way, if you're also a slow writer, maybe some of this can apply to you. But first things first, thank you to NovelPad for sponsoring this video. I was already going to talk about them a lot in this video, so I just ran it by to see if they wanted to sponsor it. NovelPad is a drafting software that I'm deeply in love with. I made a full walkthrough and review before that I'll link in the description if you want to check it out. But NovelPad is partnering with NaNoWriMo this year, so from October through November, you can use it for free. I've been using them for almost a year now, and I think they're great, and I'm going to be making another video about them soon because of all of the new features they've had since the last video. So look for that soon. But let's get into the video. Here are 10 things about writing a book in 5 weeks. Number 1, I had a short outline and a brief character sheet. Both of these were super duper minimal. I did not do a very detailed outline at all. I just had a few traits for each character and their physical description so I could keep track of it, because I'm very bad with swapping eye colors throughout the story. But for the outline, I basically had a page summary of where it started and where it ended. Since my pitch for this series is Gilmore Girls set in Stardew Valley, obviously the first book had to be a character inheriting a farm from a dead relative. So I knew that was our opener. I knew the main conflict. I knew the big conflict for the first few books of the series, and I had a basic idea of the magic system. But while I was writing the book, I was experimenting with limitations of the magic system. I established the source of it, and because it's a romance novel, it has a happy ending, and there are also specific kinds of plot beats that you usually want a book like that to hit. And that's about it. I figured out the rest as I went. So I learned that I prefer having the basic beats of the story and character outlines ready before I start writing, because if I go in totally blind, it doesn't go very quickly for me. But if I go in too detailed, it's there's not room to experiment and have fun writing it. I also feel no matter how much you outline, as you write, you get to know your characters better, and as you get to know your characters better, you understand more the kinds of decisions that they'd make. So if you've already planned out all of their decisions before you know the character, they're not necessarily going to genuinely do all of those things in a way that seems believable. So I liked having it open so that the characters could decide where they wanted to go. I hate saying that. I hate people who talk about their characters like they have their own brains. But it's kind of true. So I like to know that we're going from point A to point B, but I like the characters to have room to grow along the way. The second thing that made this book different than books I've written in the past is that I wrote whatever I thought would be fun. So if I wanted a character to adopt a raccoon, they did. If I wanted them all to get high and go swim in a magical pond in the forest, they did that. It's just a fun time book, which made it incredibly easy to write. There's the central conflict and there's interpersonal conflict, and the characters are flawed, and a lot of the main character's headspace is kind of taken up with grieving a significant loss. So it's not completely sunshine all day, but it's I'm creating a world and there's a magic system. So there doesn't have to be discrimination. There doesn't have to be sexism or racism. It's a made-up world. And all the characters are basically good people, and they do want what's best for everyone else in the story, or they'll get a redemption arc in the next book. So I'm having a good time, and I'm writing it as escapism, whereas my writing in the past is how much can we make the reader feel? Sometimes books are just to be fun, and that's easier for me to write. A third thing I did was summarizing paragraphs, but not doing more than a page. So sometimes I get stuck on a sentence or a description or a certain scene, and I lose all of my momentum, and I end up trashing that writing session. So instead of just trying to get through this one thing that's not working right now, I would just summarize what I want to have happened in those paragraphs, and then I keep writing. And almost every time what happened is that I would give like a 2-sentence summary of several paragraphs, and then I just keep writing as if I'd already written those, and then the way to do it occurs to me. If you hear scuffling sounds, that is my rabbit, Tonka. Why weren't you in here until I started filming? Do you want to talk about that? Oh yeah, so I'd summarize those paragraphs and keep writing, and then once I just like started writing past it, it occurred to me how to fix that thing, and I'd go back and flesh it out. So typically I wouldn't leave it summarized for very long. It's just to keep things rolling. And I have done things like this in past projects, but my problem doing it then is that I would leave it. So whenever I went back to do the next draft of a story, half of it was summarized, and it wasn't even like super specifically summarized. It was like, add a significant scene between character A and character B here. Mwah. And like I didn't know what happened. So whenever I went back to write those scenes, it could conflict with stuff that I'd written in the rest of the book. So to avoid just like stacking up a bunch of work for myself to do in the next draft, I would summarize things and then come back to it before I finished that chapter off. So they didn't stay summarized for long, but having like what happens before and what happens after made it clearer what was supposed to happen in that middle space, if that makes sense. Number 4 is I didn't do a ton of other work. I closed my services page on my website. I stopped doing YouTube for a minute, if you noticed. This isn't something I'm suggesting other people do because dropping everything in your life to finish a book isn't feasible for most people, but I didn't not want to mention it on a list of things that helped me finish a book in 5 weeks. Number 5 is NovelPad's tracking tool. I've never really set hard word count goals for writing sessions. I would just sit and write and see what happened, but it turns out word count goals actually made a huge difference for me. So here are the word counts that I hit each day. I just set it for 60,000 words by the end of September, and I set it to adapt the schedule to my progress, which means if I write 1,000 extra words one day, it deducts that evenly across my remaining days. If I'm 1,000 words short, it gets distributed amongst the remaining days as well. So having this tracker to do the math for me, so I just look at it and go, kept me on track throughout drafting. The 6th thing was getting my writing done first thing in the morning. Again, that's not necessarily going to work for everyone because everyone has different productivity styles, I suppose, but I read a few books about it, and basically you have a couple hours a day where you're like peak creative productivity hours, and that's usually different for everyone. For me, it was first thing in the morning. On like regular days, I would save my writing for the afternoon because I thought that if I finished everything I had to do in the day, my mind would be like cleared up and I wouldn't be thinking about anything else and I could get my writing done. In application, even though I'd spent like the whole afternoon writing, I got like 400 words in compared to writing for 2 hours in the morning and getting 2,000 words. So finding the time of day that you're most productive and writing then is really helpful, and for me that was in the morning. I wrote a chapter at a time in order. So while I did summarize those scenes occasionally, I would go back before I was done with the chapter and flesh those out and then drop it in a Google Doc for my friends to read. And they weren't giving me like any significant feedback. It was just like funny shit they had to say or like telling me what parts they liked. But it was motivational to have people like hyped to read more. And in the past, I've skipped around and wrote different parts of the book, which isn't great for continuity, and I wouldn't be able to share it with my friends as I write it that way. So instead of hopping around, if I had an idea for something that needed to happen later, I would just go and make a note in those future chapters, but keep my actual writing focus on the sequential order of chapters that I was working on. And everyone has different styles, but that kept me streamlined, which made me write faster. The 8th thing I did was every 5 chapters I would go back through for an edit. This also isn't for everyone. Some people will get like too caught up in editing and lose all of their writing momentum. But I like to go back and like set up concepts that I thought of in later chapters to keep the continuity going well. And now that I'm revising it, it's pretty clean and I haven't made a lot of changes. I'm fleshing it out a little bit because I still lean toward being like an underwriter. So every pass that I make usually comes out with a higher word count. I rarely cut things. But for example, I had added a part in like chapter 9 where the character has a sleeve of tattoos that are significant. So then I went back to chapter 2 where we got her description and I added in those tattoos. So those are the types of things that I would go back and edit for every few chapters, and that made it to where I basically had no continuity errors that I found yet. Number 9 is that I created all of the chapter headings in NovelPad. Like I said, I knew that I wanted 20 chapters, so I just made all of those headings, and then as I figured out what scenes needed to happen, I would add them to the chapters with little like 1 or 2 sentence descriptions, and I scrambled them around a bit, but it's like I had the notes for the content so that I could flesh it out. So even if you're not starting out with your entire novel outlined, you can create those scenes kind of ahead of time before you have to write them so you know where you're going. Tonka. And the 10th significant thing that I did was handling distractions. Tonka's literally sprinting back and forth in my office. What a great example. I'm very noise distracted and I have a dog and a free-range rabbit who's a piece of shit. Tonka. what are you doing? I'm also addicted to multitasking, which is not a thing. That's just doing one thing while you're distracted. Do not jump on the desk. But yeah, I have a few ways that I managed distractions in the past 5 weeks. Tonka truck. The first thing was picking the time of day that I worked. Like I said, I already work better in the mornings, but that's also before the chorus of dogs in the neighborhood starts screaming and my housemate goes to work. So the house is empty other than Tonka. So writing in the morning made it where there were the fewest distractions around. The second thing I did was own noise canceling headphones. I think those paid for themselves in my productivity within the first 5 minutes that I owned them. I'll link the ones that I use in the description. Pause for, not only does my housemate help my productivity by leaving, but he also created an app that rewards you for staying off your phone. So I like to use pause for writing sprints if I'm having trouble staying on task that day. Basically, you set a pause, and if you don't touch your phone until it's over, you earn cryptocurrency, and you can spend that on charities. So you can give someone a meal or vaccinate a dog or plant a tree. That means if you don't finish your writing sprint, you are objectively a bad person. What a great system. And the last thing that helped me with distractions is NovelPad. I'm not exaggerating when I say that NovelPad changed the way that I write. The streamlined system, the way that you can customize how it looks, I love dark mode. And the lack of on-screen distractions keep me on task for hours. I just sit there and write, which for some reason I could never do on any other program. If I write on Google Docs or Microsoft Word or something, I'm forcing myself to focus on it, but I can just zone out with NovelPad and get into my books. It's a great drafting program and it has exponentially improved my productivity. Speaking of, thank you again to NovelPad for sponsoring this video. If you've been around my channel for a minute, you might remember me talking about the time that Scrivener ate my novel. Well, NovelPad remembered me saying that, and they created the rewind feature where you can restore a previous version of your book from any time. That means if something happens, you can go back and retrieve the old version of your novel with a couple of clicks, which is a massive weight of anxiety off of my shoulders. Y'all ever feel held? Check the description for a link to try out NovelPad, and it's free through October and November, so now's the time. Happy writing. Let me know in a comment what makes you a better or faster writer, and I'll see you next week. Bye!